Hello, everybody.
Hello.
For joining. We're gonna take one more minute to see who else is gonna join. We're so excited to be hosting this webinar. My name is Paulina. I'm a part of Eurodad, the Justice team. Super happy to be hosting and moderating this webinar with a stellar panel. This is a webinar that is a part of the Global Week of Action and is happening on the day of the Globally Coordinated Mobilizations Day. And there were already rallies happening across the Global South on the topics of stop the harm, cancel the debt, and reparations and just transition now. I will share some links in the chat where you can see APMDD's actions, and we're really, really excited to be taking part in this in this Global Week of Action on the IMF and the World Bank. I will quickly walk us through the this forum, what it's going to be about. This is a forum, an exchange around advancing the call for the UN Framework Convention of Sovereign Debt. And we gather here to call on the recognition of the vicious cycle of debt and climate, and advancing the call on the fact that debt justice can never be achieved without climate justice, and the same goes vice versa. So this webinar, we're gonna have three speakers that are gonna walk us through first, why we should care about the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt, what it is, and what actually happened at FFD4, and what is coming next on the agenda of the UN Framework Convention. Iolanda Fresnillo is gonna be the first speaker who is gonna give a presentation on that. Then we're gonna have Mae Buenaventura, who is the program manager of the debt justice team of APMDD, who's gonna connect the UN Framework Convention and the whole call behind that with the actually lived realities of the people in the Global South, and use like introduce specific examples where we can see that this call makes the most sense, and why we should all get behind it, especially climate groups as well. And then we will have Carola Mejia from Latindad, who is the climate justice team coordinator, who is gonna explain the links between the climate agenda and the case for the UN Framework Convention agenda. And then we're gonna have a short sum up of the next opportunities for us to push the debt and climate agenda forward, and invite you guys to also engage and see what we can do together. We're gonna have a like couple of moments to share those reflections, and I encourage everyone to please raise their hands or input in the Q&A box or the or in the chat if you have any questions or reflections from the webinar. I'm gonna start with showing a video that was created by APMDD on the links between debt and climate. And I hope it gets you all inspired about this topic that we're gonna be tackling today. Let me just share my screen.
Indigenous peoples are among the most climate-threatened communities on the planet. Although we are among those least responsible for the climate crisis, we are hard hit by floods, droughts, heat waves, and other intensifying climate events. At the same time, Asian peoples are among those sinking deeply into debt. In 2023, the World Bank estimated the external debt of so-called low and middle income countries are at a record-breaking 8.8 trillion US dollars. As a result, debt-dependent global south governments have been funneling public funds into debt service payments rather than people's needs and rights to address fiscal constraints to remain in good standing with lenders. The Global South pays 5 times more for debt servicing than on healthcare, education, or addressing the climate emergency. This is not a budget issue. It is a profound injustice. Take the case of Pakistan, ravaged by massive floods in 2022 and millions left without clean water. Yet the government was compelled to pay 18 billion US dollars to creditors. And most of the so-called help came in the form of more loans, deepening the climate debt trap. The climate debt trap is engineered by rich countries or the global north governments that shamefully evade their climate finance obligations and responsibilities, forcing vulnerable countries to borrow more. International financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank push these loans, demanding austerity measures that slash social spending. Countries are pressured into expanding fossil fuel extraction to pay debts, and they still pay for loan funded fossil fuel projects that have further worsened the climate crisis. Austerity loan conditions that cut social spending particularly harm women who take on heavier care burdens when public services are withdrawn. But each loan adds to the tsunami of debt already engulfing the global south. It gets worse. 71% of so-called climate finance promised by rich nations is just more loans. Both the debt and climate crisis are rooted in the same economic and financial system that prioritizes private profit before people and planet. It is no accident that the global south is disproportionately vulnerable to climate and economic shocks. It is because of decades of exploitation of global south peoples and natural resources, and years of bondage to paying unsustainable and illegitimate debts. These unjust conditions must change. No country should ever have to choose between repaying debts and protecting people from the climate emergency. No to loans as climate finance. Stop fossil fuel lending. No debt justice without climate justice. Unconditional and immediate cancellation of all illegitimate debts of the South.
What a powerful video, and what a powerful way to start this brilliant panel. I think all of the messages are going to be echoed throughout this online forum as well. And again, as I said in the beginning, there can be no climate justice without debt justice, and vice versa. And of course, we're going to go into technical issues, and we're going to discuss specific proposals on the table, but I think one thing that we need to agree on is that we are supporting this call and standing together with our Global South comrades in this fight. So I'll pass it to our first speaker, Iolanda, to give us the presentation on the UN Framework Convention and what it is and why we should care about it and what it has to offer to change the current global debt architecture in the global system. I'll pass it on to you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the presentation, and thanks a lot for as you said, the very powerful video. I hope you can all see my screen. Suddenly I stopped seeing that. As Paulina was saying, I'm going to be introducing the UN Framework Convention and why we should care about it in a webinar that is about debt justice and climate justice. And as the video showed very clearly, there is a very profound link, or there are very profound links between the debt crisis and the climate emergency. This debt climate trap or vicious circle between debt and climate crisis. There are plenty of resources around explaining how they interact and feed each other. And the worse we get into the debt crisis, the worse options to tackle the climate emergency, and the most vulnerable countries are to the climate emergency, the worse that situation they get. And if we analyze that there are these two problems are interlinked, we also must come to the conclusion that the solution should also be interlinked, because we cannot address climate change challenges without addressing the debt problems, and we won't be able to achieve what we could call sustainable levels of debt, sustainable from our perspective, not from the IMF and World Bank, so sustainable for life and rights, if we continue to ignore how climate change impacts this debt sustainability. And this takes me to the proposal of the UN Framework Convention, because the systemic and structural proposals that we have on the table to address the debt challenges and the debt, not just the debt problem and the debt crisis, but also to prevent future debt crisis, are also solutions and reforms that we need to address the climate emergency. Let me explain some of the reasons. For instance, debt resolution as offered, and a lot of quotes, through the common framework and other debt restructurings, completely ignores the climate change context. For instance, Zambia, who went through their restructuring, still not finalized, despite what the IMF is saying, still negotiating with banks, with private creditors, got insufficient debt reduction in a context of a massive drought that wasn't taken into consideration in that restructuring process. Suriname, for instance, that also got some debt relief through a restructuring process outside the common framework, was made to agree on tithing the profits of exploiting new fossil fuel to repay debts in the future. So pushed into exploiting more fossil fuels to be able to repay private creditors. What we get from, and we will see in FFD4 as well, when we get from the institutions is financial innovations, where we get along, even in COP30, is innovative instruments to deal with sometimes both debt and climate emergencies, like ESG finance, or green bonds, for instance, or climate bonds, or therefore climate swaps, or climate resilient clauses. All of these and many others innovations are definitely not a solution. These are small fixes, false solutions, most of the times inadequate solutions that work for the financial markets but don't work for the people. And we have to acknowledge that recurrent debt crises are the consequence of structural problems. So if we don't tackle those structural problems, it's impossible to get out of this debt trap, of this endless debt trap. And one of these structural problems is the international financial architecture that is not fit for purpose because it lacks fair rules for responsible lending and borrowing. It lacks a framework for responsible debt management or mechanisms for debt crisis resolution. In this context, civil society and also global South governments like the Africa Group at the UN or AOSIS, which is the Association of Small Island Developing States, are pushing for what we have called the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. So to start an intergovernmental process that is inclusive, that all governments have a seat on the table, that was to be decided at the fourth Financing for Development conference that happened in Spain last June. Let's see if that delivered. To create what we call a new legal framework that should encompass, should include all of the different reforms that we see necessary to have what we could call a fairer debt system. All the necessary rules, principles, and structures to deal with the different problems and the different gaps in the international financial architecture on from a justice, from an economic and social and climate justice perspectives, and not just addressing the resolution of that crisis, so not just for delivering debt cancellation, but covering the whole cycle of debt, from the moment that there is borrowing to debt management to obviously resolution when there is a problem for paying the debt. What is it that we are proposing within this UN Framework Convention? First and foremost, a fair and transparent multilateral debt cancellation and debt restructuring mechanism. This is the fair resolution mechanism is something that civil society and many academics, experts, and particularly global South countries, G77 countries, have been calling for ages now. We were close to this in 2015, but obviously creditor countries blocked it at the UN. And the idea is that we need an independent space, independent from creditors and from debtors as well, that offers fair debt restructuring, including debt cancellation rules, not just a fight between or a negotiation without any rules between debtor and creditors in a total asymmetry of power. So fair debt restructuring rules, including debt cancellation in those rules, in an independent framework. Some people have called this an arbitration court. Some people are calling this a debt resolution mechanism. It has different names and different options, but for the UN Convention to once and for all discuss this and set up this debt resolution mechanism, but not stopping there, also preventing debt crisis. So this UN Framework Convention should address the establishment of binding responsible lending and borrowing rules as well. We have now voluntary responsible lending and borrowing principles that don't work, that are not implemented. So we need binding rules and means for accountability and implementation of those rules. And those rules should also be discussed in this Framework Convention process. We need new approaches to debt sustainability, and we know there is a discussion in the IMF and the World Bank right now on how to review the rules for debt sustainability analysis for low-income countries. We don't think that's enough. We think we need to have a more democratic and inclusive process to discuss not just small fixes into the low-income countries' debt sustainability frameworks, but a full new approach to what is debt sustainability. Some of the things that were discussed at the FFD4 and that are being advanced is the issue of debt contract clauses to provide for sharing risks, particularly linked with climate and other catastrophes. We support that as a step forward, but a step forward towards what should be a comprehensive automatic debt service cancellation mechanism that protects all global South countries from extreme events, not only related to climate and to other environmental hazards, but also to economic and security shocks. Such a mechanism can only be established in a multilateral forum and not contract by contract. We also thought that, or think that the UN Framework Convention should deal with establishing a binding global debt registry to promote transparency, not only on the debt levels, but also on the conditions of the debt contracts. So having access to the debt contracts, debt audits, promotion of debt audits to investigate and identify cases of illegitimacy of debt. Also to promote through this framework convention the establishment of legislations, particularly in key jurisdictions like the New York and London jurisdiction, UK, that govern over debt bonds, over debt contracts, but also in borrowing countries and in creditor countries to ensure a democratic and transparent governance of debt and management of debt. And then finally, also the regulation of asset management industries. These are investment funds like BlackRock and others, and credit rating agencies, including the establishment of a public credit rating agency at the UN. What happened on FFD4, and I'll try to be fast with this, and what we asked for, what we got, and what are the caveats of the different processes. We were asking for a UN Framework Convention. We didn't get it. We got an intergovernmental process agreed to make recommendations, this is a key word, to close the gaps on debt architecture. This issue of making recommendations was included by Global North countries at the end of the negotiation process, and it massively waters down the commitment of an intergovernmental process that cannot decide on what are the reforms that need to be applied, but can only make recommendations. And they also introduced a dialogue between member states, UN, IMF, World Bank, and Paris Club, and others. And funny enough, they said that this should build on the review of sovereign debt architecture envisioned in the Pact for the Future. This was commissioned to the IMF. The IMF just published a terrible paper dealing with this, which is definitely not the good basis for this process. We were asking for multilateral debt restructuring mechanism. What we got was reinforcing the common framework, which is a framework for debt restructuring that is not working, that is not delivering insufficient and timely debt cancellation. There is a commitment to kind of reform or push for reforms within the common framework, but it's still within the G20, which is a non-inclusive and non-democratic space to decide on debt. We were calling for binding responsible lending and borrowing rules, as I was saying, and we got a working group led by the UN Secretary General on responsible lending and borrowing, together with the IMF and the World Bank, as if the IMF and World Bank knew a lot about responsible lending. We don't think so. And we didn't get binding rules for, by the way. But anyway, a working group. Let's keep an eye on how this goes. We also got something that we were pushing for. It's not a major thing, but it can really make a difference, which is measures to curb corrupt borrowing and lending, utilizing the UN Convention Against Corruption. This is a convention that exists in the UN, and it would be introducing an article there to make corrupt or predatory lending unenforceable, meaning that a creditor cannot ask on courts to be paid back if there is corruption involved in their lending process. This is quite interesting because it would really push for responsible lending. If creditors cannot get their money back if there's corruption, then they will make sure there's no corruption. That's the rationale behind it. We were asking for new approaches to debt sustainability. Obviously, we got supporting the review of the low-income country debt sustainability analysis by the IMF and the World Bank. The commitment mentions including climate and nature and multidimensional vulnerabilities. in that review, which is a little bit positive. We were asking for this automatic debt service cancellation mechanism. Obviously, we got debt clauses, a debt post-clause alliance. We also got a debt swaps hub committed in Sevilla. Lots of false false solutions and distractions. We were asking for a binding global debt registry, and we got a consolidation of existing debt databases in a single global debt data registry. This could seem very similar to what we were asking for. However, we were calling for an independent registry. This is housed at the World Bank, which is a major creditor. And the paragraph ends saying, by respecting privacy and data protection, which is terrible because then it means it's not accessible. We were asking for the establishment of legislation, and we got a commitment to encourage jurisdictions to consider passing legislations, not really a commitment. Regulation of credit rating agencies, we were calling for, well, credit rating agencies are called to review their methodology. Not a UN public credit rating agency, but there's a welcoming of an African credit rating agency. They agreed to establish a special high-level meeting on credit rating agencies. It seems that next year is going to be the first one, and encouraging countries to consider national regulatory frameworks. So not global legislation and regulation of credit rating agencies, but for each country to do their own. And then capacity building to support countries to engage better with credit rating agencies, as if the problem wasn't that these credit rating agencies are too powerful, but it's that governments don't know how to relate to them, how to engage with them. I know I'm out of time. Just two more things. What we got, and it's promising, it's the borrowers platform. With a UN agency as a secretariat. It seems as this is going to be UNCTAD. This is a commitment. This is something that Global South has been pushing, and it's something that is happening already. They had their first meeting yesterday, apparently. And also encouraging creditors to lend in local currencies. This is something that could also make a difference on cutting dependency on the dollar. Obviously, it's not ending the debt crisis, for sure, because it's more lending, but at least it's a step forward. And let me finish by this. Because from that reading, it might seem, oh, we got some things. The glass could be half full, no? No, it was a missed opportunity. We could have got much more. Global South countries, particularly Africa Group and AOSIS, were pushing for much more, which was a commitment on a UN framework convention. We didn't get that. And we didn't get that because of the opposition and the blockage of creditor countries, particularly Global North countries, with the EU at the top of it. We can't be happy about the outcome. There are things to work on, obviously. The battle was lost. The fight is not over. And there are some things in the FFD commitment that we can use to continue this fight. Borrowers platform, the working group on responsible lending and borrowing. We're not happy about it, but we're going to keep an eye and try to make the most of it. The UNCAC, the corruption convention on predatory lending. There is a second committee resolution coming on from the UN. Maybe there is a mentioning of the intergovernmental process there. We need to watch up what EU, Spain, and creditors' intentions are to water this intergovernmental process down. The FFD forum in spring next year is going to be key to see how things are evolving. And we know that Spain is working on a follow-up mechanism for the commitment, so also look up for that and see what they measure as successes. Thank you. I'm sorry if it took a bit longer.
No, thank you so much, Iolanda. I think it takes time to break down these very technical issues, and it's a pleasure that you did this for us. I think this was extremely useful to set the scene for where we're at with the convention and all the technical elements that are going into that. But I think now it's time for us to take a step back from these technicalities, and maybe also hear from more lived realities and understanding how that actually how the debt and the climate crisis impacts the people and the planet on a daily basis. That's why we have Mae here. She's been the champion of this Global Week of Action, and she just came back from a rally in the Philippines. So it's great to have you. Mae, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Paulina, and also great thanks to the presentation of Yolanda, because I'm going to also pick up on that. And so a really major problem is the absence of voice for the Global South on that problem. So that is really ironic because, that has been a major obstacle to the advancement of southern economies and societies, and yet we are not at the table, no, when these issues are being discussed, or we don't have enough of the power that the shareholders of the IMF and the World Bank have, which makes the decision making in those arenas very problematic. So that's I think one of the really big factors that's behind the push for a UN-hosted space and mechanism, because there's this very clear absence of a fair, equitable, and transparent space and mechanism, and because current decision-making on debt problems remains the purview of lenders, such as the G20, including China, Paris Club, the IMF and the World Bank, of course, also the private creditors mentioned already by Yolanda, such as asset and investment firms. And predictably, the decisions, of course, that come out of it are very much aligned with their interests and based also on a very narrow debt sustainability framework that is basically a country's capacity to pay, which of course does not look into many other factors of that borrowing country. So some attempts have been put forward, initiated by the World Bank, such as supposedly a global platform to address these problems, no? Such as the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, but which was established by the IMF and the World Bank and the G20 presidency at the time, which was India. But again, we see that who are in the majority, the powerful lenders are in the majority. So we have problems with transparency. There are also no clear timelines, and it's not a statutory framework, no? Relying also on voluntary principles for responsible lending and borrowing, which we know has not and will not work if it's voluntary. And such measures also continue to insist on the common framework for debt treatments beyond the DSSI. And the common framework is, of course, as we know, is in itself problematic. So absent any rules-based system governing debt problems, this is currently the go-to of debt-distressed countries, no? The common framework. But we are well aware of its flaws and its failings. There's clearly no participation of Global South countries, also very limited in scope, as it does not include, or it's only eligible for, I think, around 70 countries. So ironically, a middle-income country, which is Sri Lanka, was the first country in Asia to default in this century. Also, Pakistan, which is a middle-income country, is in a very dire debt situation as well. So what do these conditions mean for borrowing Global South countries? First of all, it highlights the sheer imbalance of power between lenders and borrowers, between Global South and North. And unsurprisingly, Global South countries are caught in a very poor negotiating position in these lender-dominated spaces. And we see a lot of anti-poor, anti-people consequences of the conditions that the lenders impose. So take Sri Lanka, that after 16 IMF lending programs, it is now on its 17th. It's now in this situation where it's been reduced to practically mendicant status, no power at all at the negotiating table. So some of the conditions in the bailout include increase in regressive taxes, which, as we know, really hits the poor and particularly women hard, as it claims a bigger share of poor people's income. Also, austerity and other fiscal consolidation measures. These include fuel subsidy cuts, steep interest rate hikes. Also, if we take education, Sri Lanka used to really lead in terms of public education, but the spending for that has been deprioritized, and it is now one of those seriously lagging behind. There's also been wide-ranging tax exemptions that's been imposed. So one report said that in 2022 alone, the cost of tax exemptions reached a staggering amount equivalent to 56% of revenues, or nearly 3 times the education budget. So this is all aligned with the standard prescriptions of making your environment attractive to foreign investors and the private sector. The bailout that was approved for Sri Lanka in 2023 restructured the country's debts, but at the same time, debt servicing obligations are very high. And in fact, the trajectory is that they will not be able to reach the requirements that are imposed on them when this bailout is supposed to expire in 2020, by 2028. Also, Pakistan was also showed in the video, and perhaps one notable thing here is that it's also being asked or penalized with surcharges, which are the additional fees added to the standard loan costs, because it has a debt that's become very high, and it's one of the countries that's one of the top countries paying the highest surcharges to the IMF. So a year after it was hit by catastrophic floods in 2022, that was also linked to glacier melt and the climate crisis, it was one of the top 5 countries paying the highest IMF surcharges. And that was happening at a time that it was barely surviving due to that event, that saw almost 2,000 deaths and 33 million people displaced, and more than 40 billion in estimated economic losses. And also lack of drinking water, safe drinking water, that of course affected children, and they were in danger of a health crisis because of waterborne diseases. So also in the case of India, the case, as you know, there was a case filed against one of the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group, because of the way that it has bankrolled this coal plant, the Tata Mundra coal plant. So I just saw that last week, the IFC said that it has formally ended its monitoring of the devastating impacts of the Tata Mundra coal plant. This is in Gujarat, India, and they confirmed that IFC will do nothing to remedy the harm caused to local fishing and farming communities. Also, its own compliance advisory ombudsman issued the final report and closed the case that was initiated 14 years ago by communities impacted by the IFC funded project. So it's really, you know, infuriating that the World Bank continues to put itself as a driver of leading programs for poverty alleviation, and the IFC itself has stated that its mission is do no harm. No? But if we look at this area, it has that plant has devastated the local marine environment, also depleted freshwater resources, inflicted harm on the health of people because of the polluted air, the contaminated crops, and fish and homes contaminated with fly ash and coal dust. So the convention, the UN Debt Convention that global civil society has and continues to fight for, is, we think, an important step towards democratizing debt governance, no? And ensuring, and perhaps through that, but ensuring that through that, no, debt reforms are well grounded in these realities, and perhaps therefore more responsive to needs and challenges on the ground. So such an instrument also opens opportunities for reviewing and, if necessary, revamping dominant debt sustainability frameworks to include climate risk, wealth and or income inequalities within countries, human rights, and other factors that should inform assessments of debt sustainability. So we know that the UN is not perfect, but it's still the only multilateral arena we currently have where countries, especially the majority of borrowing global south countries, can have a relatively greater assurance of having a voice and a say, and where power imbalances can perhaps be mitigated somehow by global south countries coming together as regional blocs or as like-minded groups. So we're pressing on with that fight. We know that this is going to be for the long haul, as what happens with the UN processes, no? As what we've also seen with the tax convention, which I think took more than 15 years. But I think the journey is as important as the destination. And in that journey, we're going to talk a lot about what's wrong with the current system, and also sharing with communities and civil society these issues that we're talking about, often about how onerous the loan conditionalities are, how we continue to pay for projects that actually harmed us, and so forth. So yeah, this the job is not over, and we're going to stay the course. Thank you.
Thank you, Mae, for this wonderful presentation, and for also showing the perspective of the Global South civil society, and just uncovering the impact on the communities. And this, we always talk about the vicious cycle, but actually pinpointing what actually happens to the people on the ground is super important. And I agree that we're here for the long haul, and that's why we need lots of supporters on our side. And I think this ties really nicely to our next speaker, Carola Mejia. I think, Carola, you're best placed to connect us with a wider range of movements, and that's why we're organizing this webinar, to also bring awareness among climate groups, to get behind the call for the UN Framework Convention. And yeah, the floor is yours. If you can say from your experience, why do climate groups need to care about this, and how's the call for the convention linked to the climate agenda? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paulina. Thank you to all the people that has joined this webinar. Well, as we have already seen in the video, in what Iolanda and Mae have been explaining, debt is a neocolonial instrument to keep our countries in the global south conditioned to this vicious circle that is increasing every time, and that unfortunately has all these vulnerable groups in the center of its impacts. And we are conditioned to a very unfair financial system that needs to change. We are condemned to a pathway of extractivism, which is very critical in our countries because it is representing a lot of pressure in the territories. It is representing vulneration of rights of the indigenous people, communities that are trying to resist to extractive activities in their territories in the name of growth. And as we have already seen, there is this vicious circle, and the relationship between debt and climate is super clear. And that is why we have been working so hard in these issues in this group. Just to mention some other elements and evidence we have from Latin America and from some studies we have done in Latindad. We can see that in this table, for example, we can see that countries like Colombia, Peru, and Suriname are paying more than 10%, Colombia 20% to debt service. They are using that money, public money, to repay for this debt, external debt. But they are using less than 1% in some cases to invest in climate action or environmental spending. So greater debt service implies less public money to invest in climate mitigation and adaptation. That puts a lot of our countries in a risk of not fulfilling our own climate commitments. We have less resources available to recover after catastrophes. And we have to say that all these economic losses because of climate change right now are being covered with more debt. And we have a new loss and damage fund, which has been created and now is being discussed. But as you can see, it will also provide loans, which is terrible for people that is losing everything they have. So loans is always a part of these solutions that this unfair system is really always providing us. As at the beginning of the video, and I think Iolanda and Mae also referred to climate finance. 2/3 of climate finance right now are loans, which are increasing the high debt levels in our countries. And at the end, we are the ones paying for a climate crisis that we haven't really contributed much. And also, as we were seeing from the beginning, more debt represents more pressure to keep investing in destructive sectors, hydrocarbons, mining, agribusiness, to guarantee this debt repayment, because we need the dollars to repay these debts that come in dollars, as our colleagues were mentioning. And Iolanda mentioned the case of Suriname. My country, Bolivia, is highly indebted, and right now we are trying to see where are we going to get these dollars from, because we are getting out of gas reserves, and now we are going to go to the IMF to receive a loan, and loans from IMF, as Mae was also mentioning, have these conditions that you need to keep investing in destructive sectors to guarantee the debt repayment. And that is going to just increase the vulneration of rights, the environmental and social conflicts I was already mentioning. So just to give you some other information, we are facing a climate crisis. We need at least $1.3 trillion per year to tackle this climate emergency in the global south, which is highly vulnerable to these impacts. But unfortunately, climate finance commitments are insufficient. We had a goal of 100 billion annually that has changed last year. A new climate goal was set, and now it's only 300 billion annually. But it was not only a matter of amount or quantity, it was a matter of also fighting for quality, because it is really, really terrible that 2/3 of this climate finance are loans, and that should not be happening. And what we see is global north countries saying that there's not enough public money, but we can clearly see they are going to sectors that are harming people. They are being used in military spending, reaching 2.46 trillion in just 1 year. They are going to global fossil fuel subsidies, 7 trillion in 2022. They are going to tax havens because there are a lot of people that also is not paying for what they should be. And there's a lot of tax abuse as well. And they are promoting false solutions. They are promoting a greater role of MDBs, multilateral development banks, which are not going to solve the problem if they still give us climate finance as non-concessional loans. And this graph can show that 89% of climate finance provided by MDBs, like the World Bank, for example, were loans, and 73% of them were non-concessional loans. So this is not money that is going to help. This is going to increase the debt problems in our countries. They are promoting blended finance, saying that the private sector is the silver bullet for all of this. They are promoting market-based mechanisms that are not really solving the climate emergency. They are promoting debt for climate and nature swaps, as Iolanda was mentioning. And these swaps are not new. These are a failure of an unequal, unjust, and neocolonial international financial system. And in the climate finance architecture, which is really not responding to our needs. And using a metaphor, therefore, climate swaps are like putting a Band-Aid on a patient that is suffering from a cancer and needs a really, really profound treatment in time. And these deformator swaps and therefore climate swap have a lot of problems. And right now they are being discussed as part of these negotiations related to climate change towards COP30. We have seen in cases like the Galapagos in Ecuador, for example, that they are slow and represent bureaucratic processes that are mostly led by creditors. They represent high transaction costs. They could treat democratic governance and may perpetuate forms of domination in countries like mine, in Bolivia, Ecuador, others in the global south. They allow creditors to determine the national policies on conservation and climate action and could transfer powers to foreign NGOs and companies that are not accountable. And I am saying not accountable because, for example, in the case of Galapagos, the Galapagos Life Fund was established in Delaware, which is some kind of tax haven. And it had a lot of problems and it didn't really made the local communities participate. That has led to a process within the Inter-American Development Bank that civil society has been pushing. These deformator and climate swaps have lack of transparency and participation of local communities, as I was mentioning. When this swap was started, it was announced as the biggest swap ever. And when we tried to find out the conditions, there was not public information about the conditions because they are becoming very complex with a lot of bonds and things in the middle. And they are not fast to disburse the money. For example, after 1 year, we have seen what happened with Galapagos, with the debt swap of Galapagos, and there was not $1 disbursed for conservation. But we also need to see that, okay, yeah, we have a financial debt that in some cases is illegitimate and in some cases has been inherited by countries like Haiti, for example, after the colonial era. But we need to also ask who owes who. For example, there is another ecological and climate debt that we need to acknowledge. We can see here who are the 5 most ecological debtors, and the US in the first place, and who are the 5 most climate debtors. And we can see also the US in the first place. And we can clearly see that we owe these countries and that these countries are the ones ruling the financial system, which is unfair. They are the ones always promoting these false solutions. They are the ones blocking the negotiations in their favor. And they are the ones also with most of the voting power within the World Bank, the IMF. For example, to give you just one figure, the US holds 16% of the voting power within the IBDRD in the World Bank, and my country, Bolivia, only 0.14%. So we don't have really the voice or power to change anything. And that's why we need a multilateral binding convention to have all these countries in an equal and fair negotiation. And that is why it is very important for climate movements as well to demand and keep fighting for a UN framework for sovereign debt resolution, because otherwise this G20, IMF, World Bank, this unfair financial system is going to keep ruling the world, and they are not going to be responsible for what they have been causing, and they are causing still. And for example, in the UNFCCC, there is a UN Framework Convention for Climate Change. There are some principles that are basic for climate justice movements. For example, the recognition of the common but differentiated responsibilities. In these negotiations, we acknowledge that these countries are the ones that have been creating the climate emergency. These are the ones contributing more to the depletion of the world. So they have to be the ones making more effort, and they are the ones that should be providing the funding for global south countries to adapt and to tackle the climate emergency in which we have contributed less. So those kind of things are key for a fair negotiation. And that is why having a UN Framework Convention for sovereign debt resolution should be like the better space to solve these debt problems, because debt problems are not going to keep us, they're not going to help us really solve the other environmental emergencies we are facing, because we are really highly indebted, and we, for example, my country cannot has no fiscal space to really tackle the climate emergency, and now we are trying to see what are we going to do with this huge debt, and also with these huge and terrible climate impacts that are affecting the people. People is living also without water. We are facing terrible forest fires. Last year we have lost 14 million hectares of forest because of these impacts related to the climate emergency. So we need to really understand this vicious circle, and we need to understand that we need to work together in the different spaces. Maybe join this group of debt and climate, try to see and understand better what the debt implications are for our countries. And I will also, and with this I will finish. I'm sorry if I'm having more time, but I also speak from the perspective of middle-income countries, which is something that it is really limiting our countries to access highly concessional funds from abroad to tackle the multiple emergencies we are facing. And is mostly on an indicator related to the national income that the World Bank has put. So countries like even IT are considered middle-income countries. And IT is a poor country with terrible problems. And as I mentioned, we adapt inherited by France when they got free from the colonial time. So we really need to really work together and get involved in these discussions and these demands for the well-being of the people in the world, in the planet. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much, Paulina.
Thank you so much, Carola. What an incredible presentation. And I think you've said it best that we should be connecting the struggles and educating different movements on these issues and connecting the dots. We are 30 minutes away from the end of the webinar, so I will quickly share my screen for the last time, hopefully, and introduce you to a calendar of key advocacy events coming up until the end of the year. It's very simple, but I think it kind of sums up all the key relevant opportunities ahead of us. So obviously now we're situated within the annual meetings of the World Bank and the IMF. And I think an important way to support this call that we are all kind of discussing here today is to sign the statement of the Global Week of Action. I will share the link in the chat once I stop sharing my screen. And then after that, we have 4 main events that are going to take place on debt. So there's going to be an UNCTAD 16 meeting in Geneva from the 20th to the 23rd of October. Iolanda has mentioned a huge institutional power that UNCTAD can have in terms of the call for the UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt, and specifically for the responsible lending and borrowing principles. And so this is one of the key processes that we're keeping an eye out. And also another thing that we're preparing from the Debt and Climate Working Group is a webinar on the 30th of October. Details to come out soon. But this is basically going to be an effort of us to connect all of these kind of institutional advocacy events with debt and climate work. And it's going to be a reflection of post-annuals, I guess also post-UNCTAD 16, if there are going to be any relevant debt and climate elements, and a pre-COP webinar for civil society to kind of gear up energies ahead of COP 30. Then another thing that is going to happen is the Second World Summit for Social Development. We're still to see what kind of details are going to come out from that. But of course, the main event of this year, the main culminating event, is COP 30 in Brazil. And one of the ways that you can support this work on debt and climate is to obviously join our working group. It's a very vibrant space run by a coalition of international civil society organizations, and it's an open group. We have regular meetings, and we're organizing these types of online forums and webinars, and kind of making links between the debt and the economic justice and climate justice movements. And towards COP 30, ahead of COP 30, we're gonna launch a mini series on false financial solutions. All of the speakers have touched upon these very technical elements, and we want to break them down. So we're going to be talking about debt swaps, debt clauses, blended finance, TFFF, which is the Tropical Forest Facility promoted by the Brazilian presidency. So we're going to have the launch webinar on the 5th of November during one of the meetings of the Debt and Climate Working Group to help colleagues have more kind of technical breakdown of these false financial solutions. And of course, there's going to be the G20 summit in South Africa. There's a big debt component, of course, because of the common framework that is infamously governed by the G20 and is currently failing. So we have prepared a letter to the G20 presidency on debt. I will also share all of the links in the chat where you can even see the press coverage that we received. It was run in coalition with our African partners. And obviously, there's going to be more information coming in different spaces where you can see what can come out of the G20 as well. I'll stop sharing my screen, and in the interest of time, jump straight to the Q&A. I think we have really great questions. So I will start maybe with, give me a second, with Jack. I will quickly unmute you. I know that you've shared your questions via email, but if you can maybe summarize them for our speakers here because they didn't have the time to take a look, that would be great. And the floor is yours.
Hello, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Hello there. Yeah, I have some questions. I'm in Jamaica, and I have a problem with the UN and the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I want to know why state investment in renewables isn't advocated for. For instance, the UN, the World Economic Forum, they produced a video about solar power schools, and in it, they were using the schools in different states to actually pay the school teachers more. So we know this is actually viable. And in Jamaica, a solar investment pays for itself in under 4 years. So what our countries could do is, instead of continuing to indefinitely pay for electricity bills for our schools and public infrastructure, we could then redirect that money to debt financing. Sorry, not debt financing, sorry, to finance a loan to pay for solar investment. You understand what I'm trying to say here?
I think so. Yeah.
And the other thing is that the IMF, they created a loan facility called the Resilience and Sustainability Facility. Now, this is supposed to be a green energy loan, but in Jamaica, we got 764 million, and all that money, or nearly all of it, just went straight into debt financing. And as I said, that money could have actually taken all our schools, all our public infrastructure off the grid, and also built at least 2 waste energy facilities. So that would save us money, because we're not paying electricity bills. It would be obviously climate smart. It would create jobs, but instead they've used that money to finance debt, and that's not right. And so my problem again with the UN is that it is actually, all its solutions are based on capitalism. And that's a big problem. We could actually use public funds to fund some of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I mean, it's a great question, and I'll leave the speakers to answer it. I think maybe it's best that we collect a few more questions, and then I'll open the floor for our speakers to tackle them. There's also another question in the chat on the UN Framework Convention that's specifically targeted towards Iolanda. I think you saw it on whether we should have gotten more in terms of the UN Framework Convention, and what should have we done better within our capacity. And then there are 2 other questions, or actually more coming up. So thank you so much for being active in the Q&A box. There's one on approaches when demanding for debt cancellation, forgiveness, and restructuring with different lenders. And there's one on lenders and whether they have an obligation to engage with relevant players before making a decision to lend to a certain country. Maybe we can start with these 3 and then go into the 2 other ones in a bit. Who wants to go first?
I can with the first one, or Carola, if you want to
go ahead. Yolanda, go ahead.
These are great questions, by the way. To Muhammad Reza, I think you really pointed at the question that we should be asking ourselves on what we should have done better as civil society. I point at 3 things, but I think we need a broader assessment. One is getting better at or maybe by starting earlier and developing more resources to get everyone aligned under this call for the UN Framework Convention within civil society. Because what we realized is that there was civil society and other agents influencing the FFD4 process and not really undertaking this call for the UN Framework Convention, and therefore not supporting the Africa Group and AUSIS. And I think having all of the civil society really pushing for this could have made a difference. Also, probably working more with media on this and making this call more accessible for more like public opinion and specialized media, because the whole debate around the framework convention was kept behind doors in New York and in the negotiations, and there was not an open discussion around that. And I think beyond social media, I think the traditional media could have also helped. And yeah, we need to be more people, more civil society. I think we're getting there, because there is more support to the debt justice fight, but we need a broader movement. We need to be more people, more groups, more grassroots to be able to push this, and probably also illustrate how should this UN Framework Convention make a difference for people's lives. I think that's it. On Colin's question on the fragmented borrowing and lending mechanism, and if we should have different strategies, absolutely. And I think we should have a specific strategy towards private creditors, for instance. And I think we do have different strategies, but I think we should push more for this. We should push more for a specific. It has to be very specific strategy on multilateral debt cancellation, because the World Bank, the IMF, and the other multilaterals claim that they do not have to participate in their restructurings or their cancellation, and we disagree with that. So yeah, absolutely different strategies, because they have different arguments and they act differently. And on Jack's question, I don't know if I understood correctly, but I mean, I think we do advocate for just transition investments, particularly in energy transition. What we do advocate also is for the resources for this just transition to be non-debt creating, because there is a climate debt that the Global North owes to countries like Jamaica, like yours, a historical debt, and therefore there should be grants, and there should be concessional finance, so very cheap lending for that kind of investment. And what cannot be is that institutions like the World Bank or the IMF give loans to Jamaica with market interests rates to then, as you said, to then repay the debt, but also with the excuse that it's for sustainable investment. And with this facility within the IMF, I think what is also wrong with it is that as conditionalities, it promotes a specific way of investing in energy transition and in resilience, which is all market-based, private sector focused, and not so much public investments, like you were saying. So the RST is not just wrong because the money is actually going to repay the debt, that you're absolutely right, but also through that money, they push a certain way of what we call green conditionalities, which is a certain way market-based, very neoliberal approach on how this energy transition needs to be implemented. I'll leave it there.
Maybe to complement this last question, well, the first question of Jack and what Iolanda was mentioning, we need $4.3 trillion by 2030 for a transition to clean energy. And we do advocate for a just energy transition. And as you were saying, having these kind of projects that benefit the communities, schools, should be the goal. But unfortunately, right now, energy transition is being used for benefiting big corporations and MDBs like the World Bank and others. And you are using public money to de-risk private investment, to be focused in this kind of big scale projects related to solar and wind power and others in our countries. And as Iolanda was mentioning, we want money that is not debt creating, considering this historical climate and ecological depth of these global north countries, this money for the just transition should be highly concessional for our countries. And related to what you were saying about the RST, this Resilient and Sustainability Trust, I want to just make some considerations related to how this fund, how this trust was established. After the pandemic, $650 billion in reality were special drawing rights were dispersed to the world. That was a mechanism within the IMF to respond to an emergency. All the countries were facing an emergency, 600 billion SDRs were disbursed, but unfortunately they were fairly distributed. 2/3 went to the global north countries, and most of them didn't use the SDRs. So they rechanneled some of these SDRs to this trust, to the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, to give some opportunity to global south countries to use this money if they had an IMF program. But the recipe was the same. They are using loans and they are using debt. So at the end, it's another way to keep doing the same damage and harm to our countries. And we need to understand those kind of mechanisms because, for example, Latindad is demanding new issuance and allocations of SDRs because it's a way to create money without indebtedness, without conditions, but unfortunately it's unfair distributed and it depends mostly on the voting power of these countries that have more power in the IMF, who of course are blocking these kind of decisions. So just that.
Yeah, also to add, Paulina, on renewable energy, that is precisely attached to our demand for debt cancellation, that the funds that are freed from debt servicing to be shifted to, to essential services and also to building the renewable energy that countries need, as well as the obligations of global north countries for climate finance under the UNFCCC to enable global south countries to shift to non-carbon based or fossil fuel dependent economies. So that also relates to Colin's question on this is also exactly what we are pushing as part of the call for UN Debt Convention, because right now there's no statutory framework and all we have is voluntary principles for responsible lending and borrowing, and as we know, that doesn't really work. So this is one of the asks that are included in the call for a UN Debt Convention, that they be obligated to engage to ensure that there's democratic principles are applied, including the consultations, sufficient consultations with the public before, even at the moment of debt contracting. To David, so we know how the blockers will act. We kind of have an idea how they will continue to act. So I think it's really important that we invigorate our national movements to reach out and engage with our own national governments, because we have to have really deep conversations with them on why this convention is going to benefit everyone ultimately, and especially global south countries. So as long as our governments are in that kind of thinking, in the kind of thinking of the IMF and the World Bank, and we are not able to push beyond that, what they will bring to the UN will be aligned with the thinking of the blockers. So right at the level of the national movements, that should be an important task to engage with our own national governments. Thanks.
Paulina, can I reply to Jorge's question on the tax convention? Yes, thank you for bringing this topic to the table, because it's important as well. Right now, the UN Tax Convention is being negotiated. Some principles are being negotiated, and that is why it is super important that climate justice movements get engaged in those negotiations, because we need them to include the polluters pay principle to make multinational enterprises be accountable and to pay for what all the harm that they are causing. We need the common but differentiated responsibilities and climate justice approach as part of those principles being negotiated right now. And the same way we have this group of debt and climate, we have another of tax and climate, which is working on this narrative, which is working on these strategies to influence these decisions towards the UN Tax Convention. Because when we talk about climate finance in the UNFCCC, in the Climate Change Framework Convention, some people say, yeah, we need to tax the fossil fuel corporations, for example, but the UNFCCC doesn't have the mandate to order those kind of taxes. The UNFCCC is only going to recommend some things to the governments, but the fossil fuel corporations are not held accountable there. But if we have this UN tax convention, we can try to push for a tax, a multinational enterprises tax, and also taxes for the super rich and others that could fill all these climate funds that are really important, but are running out of money. So I wanted to say that, and I think somebody asked something related to how possible is debt cancellation. This is the year of the Jubilee. We have a campaign ongoing, and 25 years ago, there was a first Jubilee process, and countries like mine, Bolivia, were benefited from debt relief. So it is possible. We need to push for it, and yeah, right now that we don't have the UN Convention for Sovereign Debt, we need to also demand and find these ways to demand debt cancellation to free up fiscal resources to tackle the climate emergency.
That's great. Thank you so much for all of these answers. And I see Yolanda's hand as well, and we will have to shortly wrap up.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on what Mae was saying also on David Archer's question about the obstacles of winning an agreement on the UN Framework Convention on Debt. I think I agree with Mae. We know the blockers, and the EU, particularly in our case, being a European network, is a big blocker. We know the US is going to be a blocker. We know China. We need to understand whether we can change their position and convince them. But I honestly think that the strategy needs to be to make these blockers have no alternative but to accept this process, like they did with the UN Tax Convention. And for that, we need strong movement. We need the Borrowers Club to work. The Borrowers Forum can be an amazing platform to outgrow power from the Global South around this proposal of a UN Framework Convention. And if that came not only from the Africa Group or the SEEDS countries, but from a borrowers platform, maybe that could be stronger in order to overcome the blockage of the creditors. I also think that we need to get better at explaining what we mean by a UN Framework Convention, because some obstacles are also within the movement. I mean, I shared some ideas, but I think that this is something that some of the Global South negotiators in the FFD4 process highlighted to us. It's like, but what do you mean exactly by this and that and that? And so I think we need to get better at also explaining and concretizing what we mean by the UN Framework Convention. And as I said before, winning supports within civil society, academics, think tanks. There are very strong think tanks, foundations, and philanthropies that are playing a huge role in advocacy these days. All of this community, beyond member states, needs to be in our side. in order to overcome the blockades. I don't think France, that hosts the Paris Club, is going to give up easily on this. I don't think Spain, where I'm from, are going to give up easily on this, unless there is a huge, powerful movement, not only from civil society, but also from academia, from the Global South governments calling for this. So those are my 2 cents. I don't know if we have time to do that before 2026, but 2027 might be a good goal. So we have all of the next year to build this wave.
Thank you so much, Iolanda, Carola, and May. I think this really sums up what this webinar has been about. We're just at the beginning of this huge road in front of us, and we're doing our best to keep the fight going, and this is one of the ways to do it. It's been a pleasure hosting this webinar and being a part of the Global Week of Action on behalf of the Debt and Climate Working Group. You are very welcome to join the monthly call, which is going to happen next week on the 22nd of October at 3 p.m. Standard European Time. I can share more links in the chat, but I want to say a great and a big thank you to the speakers. It's always a pleasure having you on these panels and connecting all of the struggles, and especially on debt and climate. I think we can wrap up here, and we will all be in touch. Thanks again, and have a good evening, afternoon, or day.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Paulina.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Clay.
Bye.